First of all, I just want to begin by saying thank you to everyone involved. I just can't name how many people are involved in this, but I just want to say thank you. And, you know, like for someone who is a bit of a routinized conference goer, say thank you in a routinized manner. Thank you for inviting me, thank you for inviting me, thank you for inviting me. But I really want to say thank you for inviting me. This has been such a special thing for me, and something which I'll touch on a bit in my talk about the gift order of life. It's something I am that fills me with gratitude, and so it captures me in a gift exchange modality, and I feel that what I'm giving is a counter gift for what has been presented. I want to treat the aracial as a critical anthropological and political problem. And I just want to quickly start by saying that I don't have necessarily, it's something will be interesting to debate, I don't have necessarily a heavy investment in saying aracial as opposed to non-racial, non-racial as opposed to aracial. But I might, as the term grows on me, because it is a term I came up with sort of like quickly when David asked me for a title. But as we will come to it, I am aiming to capture first a reality, the racial as a reality, where there is no investment in race. And so I feel that the notion of the non-racial might not be, to my mind, I'm not sure again, but to my mind, might not be as much of a break as the aracial, in the sense that when we say non-racial, we still have the racial in front of us, trying to define ourselves vis-a-vis it as not being it. And so I don't know if the aracial does the job, but the aracial is something I'm trying to think of, which takes us even further away from the racial. And I will come to it. So to be kind of like playfully about this, I want to examine the aracial as part of what I will call a recalling of anti-racism. And I am using the term recalling, borrowing it from Bruno Latour. Let me read you the quote. When Bruno Latour talks about recalling modernity, he says, when a company has distributed a product which it subsequently realizes has some defect, it carries out a recall process, usually by way of advertisement. In no way does this recall aim to damage the product, nor, of course, to lose market share. Rather, it has quite the opposite strategy. By showing consumers that the care it takes with the quality control of its goods and the safety of their users. It wants to demonstrate initiative, rebuild media confidence, and if possible, recommence the production that was too quickly halted. It is in this sense a little strange, but I will explain because that's Latour still talking, that I would like to put forward the idea of a recall of modernity, while at the same time, of course, retaining the allusion to the more literal sense of a return to founding principles, as well as my own intended meaning of an inquiry into what's gone wrong with modernity, a dysfunction which too often tends to go unnoticed, hence the usefulness of this little recall. I feel that in a sense, anti-racism is even more, can be more usefully treated as an object of a recall, in the sense that unlike modernity, anti-racism has a purpose, has a function, can be directed. It is, to a certain extent, a product. And so, in that spirit, I want to recall anti-racism, both to remember, and it's very crucial to remember, and I wrote this before I came here. Being here makes it even more important to think how crucial it is to remember and recall and build on the whole tradition of anti-racism. But also, we want to think of certain defects that anti-racism has. And I want to think the aracial in relation to these defects. Just broadly speaking, I would say, you're welcome to add to this, but that's what I could think of, that the aims of anti-racism has been, across time, one, supporting the victims of racism, a better understanding of the nature of racial injury. I think it's still an ongoing problematic. What is a racial injury? How does it affect the injured? What kind of psychological trauma, what kind of social trauma is created by racism? I think a lot of research is still needed about that racism, especially today when you have real crassy right-wing attacks in the name of reverse racism, which where there might be some injury to the white ego proclaiming to be subjected to reverse racism, but an understanding of the intensity of the colonial and slavery inherited racial injury has to be emphasized and understood in its specificity. In a way, also we can say that anti-racism aims at stopping racism. It aims at stopping or defeating racists and stopping them from being racist. But at the very least, even when we can't, there are people who try to bring legislation, etc., to stop racists from externalizing their racism. If we can't stop racists being racist, at least some anti-racists have always worked on trying to stop them from having the power to externalize their racism. Anti-racism has also worked on empowering racialized subjects. It has tried to, especially with regard, for instance, Black consciousness activism, etc. It's about recovering the self, recovering the agency of the self, recovering a certain healthy narcissism that is absolutely necessary because, as we know, racism throughout the ages has worked not so much by racists successfully hating the racialized, but racists successfully making the racialized hate themselves. And this work of recovering a form of healthy narcissism has been so crucial in the anti-racist struggle. Anti-racism has also worked on disarticulating, or is, for people who are into intersection theory, has disintersecting racism from other configurations of power. Because we know that racism, increasingly, like when Achille was talking about the importance of the articulation of racism to nationalism, not many racism today have race as a goal, as an explicit goal. No, there are some people who still think my project is to build the white race or something like this, but you know, it's a socially negligible. It's often, I want my nation to be white. So the articulation and racism feeds on articulating itself, intersecting with gender domination, sexual domination, national domination, and so it feeds on other relations of power. And this intersecting it weakens it, as many activists have recognized and tried to do so. And anti-racism also works on transforming racist relations into non-racist relations. That's very crucial. There is, as sort of like, it's something I mentioned when we were on the bus, I think sort of like the idea that no matter what, the racialized and the racist are living together. And so ways of thinking them simply as war, where in a Schmittian sense there is the possibility of extermination. That's something maybe the racist can imagine sometimes and has imagined, the extermination of the other. But it seems to me the racialized might fantasize, but has to restrict their fantasy about exterminating the people racializing them, and have to think of ways of how to transform racism, which is as a bad relation, into a good relation. And finally, fostering an anti-racist and the near-racist culture. Recognizing the ongoingness and the processual nature. You don't arrive somewhere. Society is continuously producing and reproducing racial thinking, racist modes of behavior, power, etc. And so the creation of an anti-racist culture against that thickness and sickness that David has described so well in his early work on racist culture. So why is it necessary to recall racism, anti-racism? I think we can say also that recalling anti-racism in this way is important because racism itself is continuously being recalled, reconfigured, and relaunched. I think the racist capacity for recalling has been far greater than the anti-racist capacity. The racist imagination has managed to shift from Jews to blacks to Arabs to Muslims quite freely. It has moved from modes of essentialization, modes of extermination, modes of exploitation, etc., freely moving continuously about all kind of ways, always adapting itself to dominant paradigms. When the paradigms of power are biological, racism becomes biological. When dominant paradigms of culture become cultural, racism becomes cultural. It is a quite sort of like hearty and hardy little thing, racism, capable of continually re-articulating and re-articulating itself. and creating the same effect. So I want, in a sense, then to contextualize recalling anti-racism by emphasizing a bit today how racism is being itself recalled and reconfigured and transformed. So today we can say that the most important transformations that have shaped the current dominant forms of racism are three that I can think of as particularly dominant. The first one, I don't think it is as true of places like the US, but it is, although I think it has an element of truth to it, but it is certainly true of Europe, Australia, Canada. And it's the fact that so many nations are losing the economic ground on which they are built. They are losing their structural security. There's no longer many economies that say this is a national economy. There was a time when migrants would migrate to Australia and they would just structurally be sucked into a national economy. Whether they like it or not, they get sucked into it. Today, there's no national economy. And yet, there are so many forces that require the nation to continue to exist. And so the labor of nation, the labor of creating nation, has become more and more ideological as the structural basis of the nation has become undermined. And this has led to a rise in quite lethal forms of ethno-nationalism, because the investment in the ideological has become so much greater. It is the whole future of the nation that it is, in a sense, Zygmunt Bauman once said in modernity, third world countries follow the first world. In post-modernity, it is the third world that offers the first world images of its future. And in a sense, there is a kind of third worldization of the national question. Places like in the Middle East, where national geographies were made up colonially and where there was no structure or anything, the ideological labor of maintaining the nation had been so crucial. And therefore, if you speak against the nation, you immediately go to jail. I think we're seeing increasingly, I don't know about you, but I have witnessed a transformation where my radical university raving were looked at by government as some kind of like, well, let them rave on, let them chit-chat, who cares? And suddenly I was hit by people caring and saying, no, I want to change the curriculum, I want to change, etc. This is what I mean, that the ideological has become far more salient and important, and therefore the ethno-national racializing power has become a far more dominant form. The second dimension of change is what I call the rise of exterminatory, exclusionary racism at the expense of inclusionary exploitative racism, or what I symbolize as the move from marginalization in to marginalization from the nation. Marginalization in is the classic, you know, that I need to tell you, you will not be getting a slave owner holding a placard saying blacks out. A slave owner does not want the blacks out, they want the blacks in. They want them in and marginalized in. And so this is what I mean. So there's a whole tradition of racism, which is a racism of marginalizing in, from slavery to migrant labor, But today, the dominant form is marginalization from, which is you have no place in society. Not even a marginal place in it. You are not dominated, you are in fact outside completely the sphere of domination, marginalization, on the outside, the asylum seeker. I think the prison system works also as a form of marginalization from, despite its geography of being in the interior. The third dominant form is what I call the rise of particularistic anti-racism that produces racist outcomes. I came across this particularistic anti-racism very early in my work with Lebanese Christians, Lebanese Christian migrants. And I started noticing that they were anti-racist in Australia, for instance, or in the US when I work with them. I would say, it's unfair, look what... But then they would say, and I realized that they were not saying something like, it's so bad there's racism. They were saying, it's so bad there's racism against us. In fact, these racists should understand that we are fantastical, you know. They shouldn't be racist towards us. We're happy to join them be racist against others. You know, let them give us a break. Indeed, we can lead the way in showing them how racism can be done. But let them get off our back. And this kind of racism that is also anti-racist in a particularistic way has become, and I've seen it become, very dominant. As an ethnographer of migration to Australia, I've seen it among Indian migrants, I've seen it among Chinese migrants, I've seen it among many sections of this, not obviously not holistically, but I'm saying there is this tendency where people say, my culture is great. My culture is great. What's wrong with you? Can't you recognize how great my culture is? Why are you racist towards my culture? Go and be racist towards indigenous people. You know. And I think today this form of racism has taken its ultimate institutionalized form in Israel. In the struggle between a universalistic anti-racism that existed in the Jewish communities and a particularistic anti-racism, it is the particularistic anti-racism that has won and institutionalized itself. In fact, I think today Zionism in Israel represents the ultimate of all these tendencies I have spoken about. Whether in terms of the need for racialized ethno-nationalism, whether in terms, think about Israeli apartheid versus South African apartheid. South African apartheid was an apartheid of marginalization in. It was a labor apartheid. It needed the labor of the blacks. Israeli apartheid has simply no need for Palestinians. No need for. You get logics of extermination. And extermination doesn't have to be always in the sense of let's kill them all. Now on the spot. Extermination, as I sort of like mentioned once in a little sort of like interaction in Australia. In Australia, you know, you have on the farms, I'm sure many of you have examples here too, how farmers with big properties leave old trucks and let them rust. And I think sort of like there is this kind of extermination that is happening today. in Australia against indigenous people, asylum seekers, etc. It's a bit like, let them rust away. Whenever they completely disintegrate, they disintegrate. The fact that it's happening slow motion does not mean that it is not a process of extermination. And so I feel that each era has its own ultimate racism and anti-racism. Just as there was a time you cannot be anti-racist and be pro-slavery. You could not be anti-racist and be pro-apartheid. I think today you have to give me a break and go away from my side if you think that you can be anti-racist and not be anti-Zionist. You cannot. Don't feed yourself illusions. So it is then because of these dominant modes of deployment of racism globally that we need to recall anti-racism. And it is particularly because of this last question of racist anti-racism. That is the question that we want a racism that produces a qualitatively different state of the social. We don't want an anti-racism that reproduces another racism. It is because of this that the question of the aracial becomes so crucial. I would call the aracial here a mode of existence characterized by a radical indifference. I mean, it's this question of radical indifference to race that I want to explore as a part of an alter racist racial politics. This is where my work has always been about this. In critical anthropology, my work has always been concerned with this relation between the anti-moment and the alter moment. The way radical thought across history has always embodied a certain opposition to an order of things, and at the same time, it has embodied an imagination of another way of being, another way of existing. This combination is very different. You can trace it all the way, sort of like in our radical modernity, to the struggle between communism and anarchism. Each one has different conceptions of how much you emphasize building opposition and how much you dream of a different world. Marxism, obviously, for instance, had a strong imaginary of communism. But at the same time, it always aimed to subdue it and say, the important thing is how we organize, how we do it, how we defeat, how, etc. But we have a whole history of anti-colonialism that has reproduced things we don't like, all kinds of things that have reproduced things we don't like. And it's quite crucial, without devalorizing the anti-moment and maintaining its importance, to re-inject the alter thought. From an analytical perspective, I think the anti-moment is far more sociological. I'm not talking about discipline of sociology. So in anthropology, you can't do anthropology without sociology, for instance, or cultural studies or whatever. I'm not interested in these disciplinary grounds here. I'm more interested in a mode of approaching the social that exists in all disciplines. And so the sociological has always been the conditions of possibility, unmasking relations of power. These are all sociological questions, crucial sociological questions. But I think the anthropological moment has always been, and again, it's not just in anthropology, but across the board, the anthropological moment has been that question of we can be other than what we are. There are all these possibilities that we can be. And the critical anthropological task has always been the task of thinking those possibilities of being other than what we are. Again, you have idealistic tendencies, you have materialist tendencies. So it is then from this critical anthropological perspective that I want to confront the a-racial. Does it provide us with a space of radical alterity? A space where we can think existing in a way other than what we exist. But at the same time, I want to emphasize a tradition which says, I'm not talking about dreaming of a place where we can be other than what we are. I'm talking about the fact that it exists, that there is a material ground for it, that there are everywhere in the social a-racial spaces that can be mobilized. I'll be a little bit boring lecturer here and introduce you to a little bit to ontological perspectivism, just as a way of helping us think this problematic. You know, the ontological turn in anthropology, if you know, is very fashionable. And I think you can say I'm fashionable, I don't mind. But I hope I'll convince you that I'm not doing it to be fashionable. I'm doing it because I think it helps us think important things. So, I'm not going to go through, although I would have liked to go into the ecological dimensions of ontological perspectivism. But I'm basing most of this on some elements of the work of Eduardo Viveros de Castro, especially in a book which I think has been recently translated to English. It's called Métaphysique Cannibal Metaphysics. The first aspect of ontological perspectivism is that perspectives are not points of view on reality, but are realities. That is, realities are relations. Let me be first. This is not as exotic as Eduardo himself imagined when he started writing it. I know he did it. He did it by working his Amazonian ethnography and thinking how the Amazonians were ontological in their perspectivism. But in fact, after I read him, I actually started a whole history, a reading in the history of Western perspectivism and how it moved from art to philosophy to the social sciences. And very early in the history of perspectivism, there was a tension between people who saw perspective as a subjective view on the thing, and people who saw perspective as the thing. For Viveros de Castro, the body is the site of a multiplicity of modes of relating to the world. The body generates modes of relation to the world. And these relations create realities. Now, I don't know, I mean, I identified immediately with this for a simple fact, let me tell you. I became deaf gradually. And as I was becoming deaf, I didn't feel I lost a perspective on the world. I felt I lost a world. Sort of like hearing was not some subjective view that I had access to the world. Hearing made me relate to the world in a way that created the world of hearing. The world of hearing could not exist without me relating it to hearing. And so a loss of a relation is a loss of reality. A reality is a relation. So this is the essence of the idea of the real as a relation, and about the multiplicity of forms of realities. The second important point in the thinking of ontological perspectivism that I introduced myself into the game was the thinking of these realities as having a politics of its own. So not thinking just the multiplicity of realities, but thinking that there are dominant and dominated realities. This does not preclude having dominant and dominated people within a reality, but you have to think of it also in terms of dominant and dominated realities. This is how I re-inject the sociological tradition in the anthropological tradition and let them play together. I mean, despite the fact that Bruno Latour sort of like produced all these kind of like classically French attacks on Pierre Bourdieu, and Pierre Bourdieu produced this classically French attack. It's impossible to think with Latour, and Latour says it's impossible to think with Bourdieu. And give me a break, it's impossible to think with them and without them and together and everything. And so the fact of the matter is that Bourdieu, who actually, I have to say, despite the fact that I'm emotionally attached to him as a person, as a memory, was really bad. I mean, if you read Bourdieu, as soon as you reach a point where he's attacking someone, you know he's going to start using them, as in productively. Like, it never fails. He has attacked Sartre, and you can see Sartre. He has attacked Lévi-Strauss, and you can see Lévi-Strauss. It's automatic. And so I don't buy these things. And Bourdieu was an ontologist in some very important way. Like, if you look at Bourdieu's early ethnography of Algerian peasants and the transformation of their lives under colonialism, you have ontological struggles. You know, Bourdieu is famous for more distinction and cultural differences within the realm of power. So, but he also was a real constructivist, and this is what we're talking about here. It's real constructivism, a realist form of constructivism. There's this kind of like, I don't know where it came from, but it is really salient, this idea that as soon as you mention the word constructivism, you're thinking some kind of like, you're making some kind of light ontological statement about that it's not real, you know. I mean, a chair is a social construction as opposed to the tree. That doesn't make the chair less real than the tree, you know. I mean, there's nothing about social constructivism that immediately should lead you to think that we're talking about less real things. Now, in Bourdieu, I'll tell you the story because I think, although it's a bit silly, and it allows you certain access to what I think is the fundamental truth. Now, for Bourdieu, think that you are doing an ethnography of skiing. Skiing, I like skiing. A very upper class, middle class, whatever, sort of like in certain places. And if you're doing an ethnography of skiing with Bourdieu, the first thing you start doing is say, okay, how many styles of skiing there are? Let's say these people like to ski this way, these people like to ski this way, these people like to dress this way, these people accumulate skiing capital this way, these people accumulate skiing capital that way. Look at the domain of who is dominating, who is king of the slope. Wow, when they arrive, everybody thinks they're so groovy. They have symbolic violence in the field. You can do a whole sociology of that. Then think of swimming. You can do exactly the same thing. You know, say, swimming, who has the nicest swimming costumes, who has the nicest mode of sort of like in the pool, probably David has crucial, maybe Kelly. We've been swimming together. I don't know who has the smoothest stroke. Anyway, so we can do a sociological analysis of swimming capital. Now, there's something interesting about Bourdieu, and that is that he believes, and in a sense, if you want to follow Bourdieu, you have to accept that skiers produce the very snow on which they are skiing. People produce the very reality on which they are playing. That's very crucial. It's the Husserlian tradition. The life world is created in the very process of being enmeshed in the life world. And so skiers produce the snow on which they are skiing, and swimmers are producing the water in which they are swimming. And the skiers are having all these fights on who will have the greatest skiing capital, and the swimmers are having fight for who can have this. But for Bourdieu, the more fundamental and absolutely crucial struggle is between the skiers and the swimmers, because between the two is a struggle of two realities. It is a struggle between a snow reality and a water reality. And if the skiers win, the losers are not people who look bad in skis on the slope. The losers are really ridiculous people who are sitting on the snow with their swimming gear, unable to operate in a reality which no longer is their reality. When one reality dominates, another loses their reality. And so, for Bourdieu, the French peasant, the Algerian peasant, that's what happened. It's not that they become just some kind of like unable, sort of like a minor figure. They lost reality. Or their reality, and this is where I think I want to introduce a Deleuzian concept, transform it more ontologically. They have minor realities. There are dominant realities and minor realities. And this is where I'm heading. I want to head to how the A-racial is a minor reality in our life. How does it exist as a minor reality? And so how, for an anthropologist, it becomes an ethnographic question. Once, as an anthropologist, you accept the existence of a multiplicity of realities, of major, minor, etc., your ethnographic gaze is transformed. You have to look beyond dominant realities, look for traces, etc. And I think this is where the anthropological tradition, the critical anthropological tradition, has been at its best in providing us modes of thinking this issue. Because I think in a grand way, anthropology has defined three modes of existence, of human existence, across the ages in its work. The first is what I call domestication, the second, reciprocity, and the third, mutuality. Domestication is the most easily accessible to us. It is a mode of existence in which the world exists for us, in which we exploit the world, in which we instrumentalize it. It is a mode of existence in which both social entities and humans have defensive notions of the border. How do I maintain my border? How do I consolidate my border? And where the problematic of the border is a problematic of sovereignty. And this order produces a very specific form of otherness and racism. In the mode of domestication, the other is an otherness for us. Otherness as object. It is that objecthood that Achille was talking about in his talk. Also, probably I would like to think of it more as a mode of distribution of subjectness and objectness, of subjecthood and objecthood. It doesn't divide, these orders do not divide the world between subject and objects. It distributes, it's an unequal distribution. It's the process of unequal distribution of subjecthood and an unequal distribution of objecthood. Each person has different degrees of being subject, different degrees of being object. And what characterizes racism is not the fact that we treat the other as object. In the process of domestication, we all treat each other as object. But it is that excessive objectification, essentialization, etc. Although, you know, as you might have noticed, I didn't mention much essentialism, because I'm trying to avoid this tradition. I don't think there's anything wrong, but with sort of like characterizing racism with essentialism, but I think there's too much of this, in which we think that racism is a bad way of thinking, ultimately. You know, we do this analysis and find out that the worst thing that racists do is that they don't think well. They essentialize. You know, racists do many more things than think badly. And they're not in a tutorial with us. We're not having a debate about how to think properly with them. They want to be efficient. And we have to create counter-efficient categories, not have tutorial debates. So this is the order of domestication. The order of reciprocity, which was popularized particularly in Marcel Mauss's work on the gift, but which was present in Malinowski and even before Malinowski, and where this is, it's really quite important to think this, because first, in exchange, the border is thought of differently. The border is not where I'm worried about consolidating my sovereignty. The border is the place where I give and take with you. Here, otherness is an otherness with us. It's otherness as gift. Sure, we get something from the other. By the way, I don't know if I'm sure some of the anthropologists among you know, but there is a fantastic work that was a critique of Lévi-Strauss, Marcel Mauss, and Malinowski, written by a wonderful feminist anthropologist by the name of Annette Weiner. It's called Inalienable Possessions. And in that book, she introduces something quite crucial, because she traces gift exchange. And she accepts the idea that gift exchange is different from commodity exchange, and there is the imperative to give and the imperative. But she looks at, ethnographically, at feminine, what was described as feminine goods and masculine goods, defined by the tribes doing the exchange as feminine good and masculine goods. And what was crucial was that the feminine goods were what was kept. And she produces what she calls the problematic of keeping while giving. And what was crucial for her is that in the order, and that what differentiates the order of the domestication from the order of reciprocity, is that in both we might receive something, but in the order of domestication there is extraction. There is an extraction that can go to the essence of what is being of the giving subject, which can destroy them. While in the order of reciprocity, the subject still has control of the feminine center, and therefore capable of reproducing. And so here racism, and we don't think of this often, racism of reciprocity. A crucial point of Annette Weiner's analysis is that you don't just give a gift, you are a gift. I think of Lebanese greetings. I'm sure there's similar in other cultural greetings. It's so grand, like, Lebanese greeting, sort of like you see someone, sort of like, and you think, the sun has shone and the world is never going to be the same since I've seen you, kind of like, and you think, and this idea is, yeah, I've seen you, amazing. You have to think of it similar to the way we treat children when they pop up. So I thought, wow, beautiful. There is something, and this idea is that this person is not bringing us the present, they are the present. They are the gift, the giftness that is inherent in all of us. And so racism, in the order of reciprocity, is the negation of this giftness. I see you, and I say, piss off. I don't want to know about you. There's no gift here. That's then the order of reciprocity. Now, the order of mutuality is the least perhaps known, but mutuality sort of like in a most pronounced manner started in Lévi-Brieulle. And I think this is where we start having access, to my mind, to the aracial in a serious way. In a very foundational moment in anthropology, in what Lévi-Brieulle calls participation. The history of it is, it's myth, and it's told mythically because of its foundational, but it has a very important ramification, which was that there were these German pre-anthropological ethnographers working in Brazil among a tribe called the Bororos. And one of those ethnographers recorded a saying by one of the tribes people saying, "We Bororos are Araras, and Araras were birds." And the statement became, "We, the people of this tribe, are birds." And so the first ethnographers came and said, "So how do we understand this?" And said, "It must be metaphoric. They must mean it in a metaphoric way. They are like birds, or what have you." Then another series of ethnographers came and said, "Well, no, it doesn't look like they're thinking about it metaphorically." As more people started studying the language of it, and said, "Maybe now they mean it that when they die, their spirit moves into the spirit of the bird." So that makes sense, fine. Then another bunch of ethnographers deepened even more, sort of like their knowledge. They said, "Well, they're not saying this, sorry. They're saying they're birds." And this is where Levi-Bruhl came, and I think, and many others think, is a defining moment of anthropology, because he says, look, they're saying they're birds. Either you can get to a stage where you understand how a person say they are a bird and stop reducing it to something that makes your Western logic comfortable with it, or forget it. This is anthropology. Anthropology is precisely that moment where you think otherwise, where you think so otherwise that you couldn't even dream of thinking like this before. And so how do you get to the stage of thinking? And what Levi-Bruhl defined as the logic of participation is precisely this logic where, in fact, it's a situation where A and not A do not exist, where A is in not A and not A is in A, what he calls participation. I participate in your being and you participate in my being, and everybody participates in each other's being. It's a problematic of interpenetration. And otherness here is an otherness in us. By definition, it's an otherness in us. We are other to ourselves already. Now, in this mode of otherness, we see traces of it everywhere around us. It's not, and that's now what I call here the mentor racism in this. For readers of Harry Potter, it's because, and we don't often dwell on this form of racism, where the racialized is conceived as fucking our soul, as just taking us outside of ourselves. We like to stay neatly in defining racism in modes that our rationality are capable to deal with, and think that anti-racism is simply going to deal with, but racism, actually the racists know about these modes of existence sometimes much better than all of the anthropologists who have analyzed them. They move freely into this domain. Racist thought is constantly aiming to reject the giftedness of the other, seeing the other in voodoo terms, taking my soul out of me, and internalizing. Now, before I go on here, let me say something crucial about these anthropologies, why they are critical anthropologies. Because none of them, despite the simplifications that have been made through history, not a single one of those anthropologists who work there tried to say, look at the weirdos of this tribe, this is how they are, look at me, I'm rational. They all said systematically, this is a dominant form of life over there. But the fact that we can understand must be that we share this form of life. Even though it's not dominant in our world, it must be circulating among us. And so it's not, you don't need to go to the Bororos to know about mutuality. Maybe you need to go to the Bororos to know about mutuality, but once you know, you can come back where you are and start noticing that there is a minor form of life, mutuality, that is existence among us. Likewise with reciprocity. And so the conception of the social becomes the fact that we are constantly interweaving modes of domestication, reciprocity, mutuality, etc. And racism is a continuous articulation of these points. Now, these are not parallel realities. It's not that you come to the world and at one level there's domestication, at one level there's reciprocity, at one level there's mutuality. They're interwoven, and the best way I tried to capture the way they exist is what I call the lenticularity of the real. Now, lenticular mode is a word I looked for very much in my mind, because when I was trying to think these realities, I started remembering these old photos I had as a kid, where you flick the photo and, you know, if you look at it from this angle, you see something. If you look at it from this angle, you see something else. Frown, smile, before, after, Jesus, Mary, whatever you like. And so, just to give you a visual sense of it, in case you haven't. See, what I'm trying to capture here is precisely the fact that this is our reality. This is how we live our realities. Our realities are by definition lenticular. We are constantly with this idea of that we are simply, you know, when I'm doing field work with my diasporic subjects, they don't say I'm torn between Beirut and Boston. They are continuously moving between Boston and Beirut. The same cup of coffee seen from this angle positions you in Boston, and the smell of the coffee positions you in Beirut. Lenticular reality is a constant articulation and movement. When we talk about the universal and the particular, it's both lenticular realities. We are not universal here, particular here. We're constantly, as Spinoza would say, vacillating between the universal and the particular. It's true that sometimes we go to a party and we think, if somebody gave us the proverbial, where do you come from? They say, you're racist, you're particularizing me. But also there are many people, not often in a university environment, who come and say to me, I went to this party, this is my first job here, and nobody asked me about Lebanon. So racism can be universalizing, can be particularizing. And in the end, what is racism here? It is the refusal to offer this space of vacillation. It is a fixer of this space of vacillation. I was very interested in Swaziland, where this person was talking about about the uncertainty of reality. And they said racism was a mode of creating certainty. It is a mode of fixing a vacillating reality. So what I'm trying to say is that there are modes of existence in which the aracial is present, in which the aracial circulates among us. It is their real moments. We need to capture them and mobilize them politically, not at the expense of non-racism or anti-racism, but in order to keep alive the possibility of another non-A racial life in our interests. Thank you.